Hi, my name is Jordan Schneider, and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm here today with Peter Lorentzen, an assistant professor of economics at the University of San Francisco, specializing in the political economy of development and authoritarianism with a particular focus on China. Peter, welcome to the show today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Sure. So before we jump into a few of your recent papers, if you could just walk us through your China story, what first got you interested and kept you interested in the country?
So I grew up in California in the San Francisco Bay Area, which has always had a lot of people from all around Asia. So that's, a big chunk of who I grew up with, people from Vietnam, China, Korea, Japan. And when I got to college and had to do a foreign language requirement, I thought that would be a good time to branch out and learn something more about, where at least one of the countries where all my friends had come from. And at the time, I was very committed to being an impractical intellectual. And so there were two choices. There was the language of the booming Asian culture where anyone practical who wanted to make a lot of money would go. And there was the language of sort of a deep, rich culture that, wasn't really going anywhere economically, but was more fascinating for a true intellectual who was above such things. So that's why I chose Chinese, because at the time, in the late 80s, China was, not the big economic growth story. It was more the culturally deep story, and we were all worried about or excited about the economic opportunities in Japan. But I decided to go the other route. Although, of course, the lesson of that is you never really know which countries are going to be the economic success stories and which ones aren't, and those decisions just kind of stick with you. Anyway, so then in 1990, in my sophomore year, before my sophomore year of college, I went on a foreign study tour to Beijing. And basically, it's been kind of a slippery slope since then, just thinking if I spend a little bit more time studying this language and culture and later this economy, then maybe I could come to grips with it. And I've never really fully mastered it, but I keep working at it.
Sure. So you, coming to your first paper, you started studying Chinese right as Tiananmen and the ripple effects were playing out. Did that at all play into, your first engagements with China being in Beijing in 1990?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely easy to get on that foreign study program because it was not a high demand thing. I guess all the students with sensible parents had been forbidden from participating, and there was a lot of sincere debate about whether people should even be going to China or engaging with China at that point. So soon after 1989. So that was a big part of it. Partly I went because I was a little bit oblivious, but certainly that transformative moment for China and for I think a lot of the world's view of China has shaped a lot of the research that I've been doing since then.
So coming to your the first paper we're going to be talking about today, Designing Contentious Politics in Post-1989 China, which sort of looks at the protests in China from a game theoretical approach. If you could talk about how, before we jump into the theory, just the facts of how protests look like in China today. Okay, well,
there's a lot of different, varieties. And so part of it is the challenge is to say what are the common elements. So everything I say has its important exceptions, but the sort of typical protest that seems to take place, not among the sort of intellectual or activist elites, but among ordinary people, for pretty much 20 or 30 years now has almost always been by a small sort of narrow particular group, like the members of one village or the workers from one or two state-owned enterprises, or maybe the people living near a particular, polluting plant that's going to go in or that's polluting already or they're worried is polluting. And not sort of larger groups as we saw certainly through a number of protests in the 80s that culminated in the 1989 movement, but also in earlier periods of Chinese history. So it's not they aren't kind of mass movements protesting, with large groups. And that's because their goals tend to be very narrow as well. So their goals are not, let's change the system or let's talk about what's wrong with the system. Instead, their goals are generally, in the late 90s, often in the countryside, it was often, taxation levels that were too high. More recently, often it's land expropriation or environmental issues. And then in the cities, the late 90s story is a lot of that was around the layoffs from the state-owned enterprises. And then, as that ultimately got resolved one way or another, more recently it's been there have been more worker protests, for instance, at foreign-owned enterprises or other private-oriented enterprises, more often in the South. But in all these cases, they're asking for something they're not asking for the right to form, say, a national union or a new labor movement. Instead, they're asking for, better pay or unpaid pensions. And the language that they frame their demands in is generally very sympathetic to the party's, at least its professed goals. So they may choose to use more Marxist or Maoist language and talk about the workers being the vanguard of the proletariat and they should be taken care of. Or they might use more, what you might think of as modern, rights-based or legalistic language, and, refer specifically to policies of the central government that have conferred upon them, greater rights as workers. But either way, they're not saying that, the system is bad. They just always complain about local implementation of the, benevolent rules or principles laid down by the higher levels. So that's kind of the key of it.
So jumping into the paper, could you walk us a little through the idea of mechanism design and thinking about the Communist Party as a mechanism designer and the way that they respond to these protests?
Sure. So mechanism design is, the paper itself just refers to it, doesn't use it explicitly, but it's a set of tools from economic theory that, or a set of ways of thinking about behavior and how to structure the incentives that people face in order to induce a certain set of behaviors from them. So that's very abstract, but examples include, just simple things like employment contracts. Do you pay someone per unit that they produce or, the amount of effort they put in? But it's also been used for much more complicated settings, the auctioning of telecommunications spectrum in order to make sure that it goes to the party that values it the most, for instance, and even for designing of matching systems like medical resident matching is also now being designed in consultation with economists using these methodologies. But the key thing in all of them is that there's sort of a mechanism designer or a principal, and then there's sort of the participants in this system, the bidders in the auction or the employees or the people looking for their medical match, the doctors, and they have information that they can't sort of disclose. They can't credibly disclose, or that they could tell you whatever they want, but they would basically possibly all tell you the same thing. For instance, I'm a hard worker and I did a great job, so pay me the most, or I'm the best doctor, so give me the best job. And you have to find a way to elicit from them sort of an honest disclosure of this information. So in China, I take this sort of framework and think about it in the context of, rather than thinking of protests as kind of this spasmodic just eruption of pent-up feeling, which, it has, certainly in any particular instance, it always has elements of that. It's not sort of a perfectly rational decision like someone deciding where to apply to college. But for purposes of the sort of mental exercise, I treat it as such, because I think that also when people protest, especially in a country like China, where, even even a fairly ignorant person has an idea that the state could react pretty badly to the wrong kind of protest, that they do it with to an extent with their eyes open, with an eye to what is likely to happen to me, what are the risks, and then what are the benefits. And given that they do this, then the government itself can bear that in mind when it sets its policies, both formal and informal, about how it reacts to different kinds of protests, and also then how it chooses to publicize its policies or its responses to particular outbreaks that become known either in a local area or increasingly with the internet. They often become known nationally. So however the government responds kind of sets a precedent. And the way that, one simple way that matters is, if you think about one extreme view is you say, well, if it's a repressive government, if they didn't like protest, then they could just crack down on the first one they see harshly, and then everyone else would, except for the most, passionate exceptions, would probably choose to just stay at home and not choose to challenge the state in that way in the future.
Sure. So that brings us to the first of your four puzzles, which is why the government doesn't fully suppress these protests. So what's their thinking behind this?
Right. So I can't claim to directly know their thinking. I don't have a secret line into the Politburo, and I don't think anyone does. We have some evidence from documents that they circulate that are internal or mainly intended as guidelines for public security officers or local officials in handling protests, and they generally so as I was saying, they if they crack down on everything, then that would get potentially everyone to be quiet, but the risk then is you have sort of a dangerous silence, where as problems emerge, people don't speak up, and so at that extreme, you end up with kind of repressed concerns, which the fear is then problems don't get resolved, and in particular, the government doesn't learn information that it wants to learn about, where is official corruption so bad that we really should deal with it. Where are social tensions particularly severe, and also which of our policies are either in specific instances or in general not working out well. If people can't stand up and communicate this, then the party might not learn it, and that means then you never know when it's going to happen, but when some kind of precipitating event occurs that could lead to a national a nationally destabilizing movement to arise, as has happened in many countries around the world. The Arab Spring being the most recent and, from the party's perspective, most terrifying example. Right, one guy, unhappy man, sets himself on fire in protest, and suddenly the whole country and even countries around it see their whole populations rise up and governments fall. And other ones just barely survive through very even harsher repression. So that's what you want to avoid, is that situation where there's so much discontent, but you don't know where it is, and you have no way to identify it, therefore you can't respond to it. The other aspect of this puzzle is that you can't, why shouldn't you just say, they have a petition system, they could just allow people to speak, right? Why is protest different? The key is that protest is particularly informative, first of all, because you actually have to have enough people who care about something to get a group together, but also because exactly because it's not really legal, it's always dangerous. But that danger means it's informative. Everyone has a grievance in every country all the time. If you tell them, is there something you'd like the government to do for you? Everyone has something that they'd like to have done for them. The question is who, as a regime that wants to stay in power, who are the ones who are dangerous enough that you really have to listen to their voice and take them seriously? And by protesting, knowing that, it's possible that they'll, in the process, get beat up by government or government-sponsored thugs or that things will get out of hand and the police will have to use force so that their leaders will be arrested. By doing that, these groups show that they're very serious.
Coming to the next puzzle, you ask why protesters aren't more aggressive. I mean, in Beijing recently, we just had two things that may have gotten people on the streets in another country, the kindergarten scandal and the moving of the low-end population. But the response has basically been entirely online with subtle Weibo posts and, no mass movements, which is kind of de rigueur in China. So what's going through these protesters' heads in that, on the one hand, they may be able to get more leverage if they speak out and get louder, but they seem to not be taking that tack.
Right. Well, in those cases, from what I've seen, no one's gotten on the street, and I think that's because they've gotten a pretty clear message from the government that they may well understand what people's concerns are, but they're not going to, especially in Beijing, it's always the most sensitive. So they're not going to accept public protest from people in Beijing about these issues. The government's going to decide what it wants to do without their input at all in terms of protest. And partly, it's pretty clear. It's not that the government is unaware of these issues. It's very much happening in Beijing. It's in the news. Everyone knows about it already. There's no need necessarily to protest to show that people care about it. Nor does the government. So there's not as much of a need to protest in a sense because it's not information that is really hidden from the government in a serious way. They perfectly understand why people would be worried about these rumors about what happened at some kindergartens, or why people would be upset about being essentially deported from part of their own country. But they don't necessarily accept, especially the second concern, they don't really accept that as valid, and citizens know that. But what I refer to in the paper is the other thing, which is that once you start a protest, if you look at the playbook of how to have a successful social movement, say in any democratic country, or in a lot of authoritarian regimes, the goal is to form a broad coalition, to find allies, to, take your maybe complaint that you initially viewed as narrow and transform it into a general statement of principle that people around the country and around the world can identify with, and recognize that they share. Because then, the more allies you have, the stronger bargaining position you should have. And that's, that is true in terms of giving yourself bargaining leverage. And so in a sort of one-off interaction, the more bargaining leverage your partner, the other party has, the more you may have to give them. So the more that you might think the government would give them, depending on, if they can mobilize, multiple cities rising up about an issue. Or, in the countryside, not just one village, but say get several counties, or a whole province up in arms. But, everyone, that doesn't happen. And I think that's a matter of choice. People are conscious of what the rules are, and those rules are, you need to show that you're a threat, but don't show that you're too much of a threat. If you show that you're too much of a threat, then you actually, cause more problems for us. And because this isn't just a one-off for the central government, they don't just, it's not just a matter of how do we best appease this group. It's also that whatever we do to appease this group sets a little bit of a precedent for the next group that has their own grievance. And so if everyone feels like they now have license to mobilize a large, national constituency behind their issue, then you'll see a lot of those grow up. And that might be more than the regime can handle, or it might give them so much leverage that the regime is no longer willing to pay them off or find a way to resolve their issue.
Sure, that's certainly a dynamic you saw recently in the Middle East. One of the central ideas that backs this policy by the Chinese government is that the protests, stabilize, and that they're controlled forest fires, that, there are enough, helicopters and firemen in the sky to put out, as opposed to actually risking the chance of it really catching fire and burning out of control. So, what do you make of the tenability of this policy.
Okay, so you're referring to another sort of central metaphor in the piece. I say that rather than there's kind of two ways of thinking about protest. One is there's a phrase that Mao liked. A single spark can ignite a prairie fire, and that's again what we've seen in many countries. A protest that might originally seem to be about mistreatment of just one group suddenly becomes a national anti-government protest. But then the other metaphor people often use these days in China when they see these protests is, it's a pressure valve. And, the idea there is that, it's perfectly benign for the government because you let them protest and maybe you give them something and then they go away. And the problem is that kind of both of these are true at the same time. People aren't just, valves that let off steam. We, in a sense, we notice what other people are doing. And so if one pressure valve goes off, that doesn't make the pressure valve next to it more likely to go off. But with protests, it does make it true. And so that's where I mentioned this metaphor of controlled burn. So in forestry, they used to try to put out all the fires, but then the problem is that, the forest would grow so thick that then on, one hot, dry summer, then everything would light up and then the whole forest would burn flat to the ground because the fire would spread so far and so rapidly they couldn't be stopped. So the sort of modern technique where possible is to, allow a fire to burn. If it starts burning, you let it burn, you keep it away from, the houses or, major areas. But if it's not burning too aggressively, you let it go because that's kind of a natural ecological process. And then if another fire happens later, it won't spread rapidly through that area that already had a fire. And so protests are similar. If a protest happens, you can take care of their problem. That's good. But like a fire, the risk is if one protest happens and it sparks another, then you might end up with a general conflagration. So the question is, which one are we more, how easily are these fires spreading? And I think it's really neck and neck. I think China was in a really the party was in a really good position in the 90s and 2000s in the sort of pre-internet era, because China is such a large country with relatively weak transportation links, relatively weak communication links. If you had a rural protest happening in Sichuan, people weren't going to hear about it in Shandong, and it wouldn't. So there wouldn't be an issue, or even an urban protest, would take some time before, people around the country would hear about it. Now that's potentially no longer true. And so, the risks of letting something burn a little bit, may be more severe. And I think that may, my guess is one of the factors underlying kind of the change in policy under Xi Jinping to be a lot more controlling over everything is a recognition that some of the laxity, which might have been actually beneficial in the Jiang and Hu eras, might actually pose a greater risk now than it did in those times. So that's the concern. But at the same time, you don't want to end up in a situation where you get no feedback and again don't learn about problems in time to solve them.
Sure. So then, according to you, it's not just Xi being Xi with the more recent crackdown on NGOs and web conversations and what have you, but actually his response to technological change and the ability of these protests to really catch on that has shaped a lot of his policies on these sorts of issues.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. There certainly, is individual personality, tendencies or trends, which I'll leave the psychologists and historians to puzzle out with better information. But I think there is at least one factor in this is that is what you say, that this changes in technology make that strategy, that ability to control localized conflict or contention more limited than it used to be. And so that means they have to keep a tighter lid on everything from the start.
Great. So, Peter, let's just spend the last 10 minutes and walk through another one of your recent papers called Racing to the Bottom or to the Top, Decentralization, Revenue Pressures, and Governance Reform in China, which tries to explain, tries to look at the decentralization of the past few decades in China and understand why there's variance in governance and how different provinces respond to orders from on high. So first, could you walk us through a little bit the history of decentralization in the PRC?
That's a pretty complicated one. I mean, it's always been a complex issue because, there's actually been a tradition even under Mao. We often characterize it as a totalitarian era, and certainly there are these very centralizing tendencies where, he would whisper something to an aide, and then everyone around the country would feel compelled to do exactly that or whatever they perceived that to be. But at the same time, there was more scope for local experimentation, which scholars working on that era have identified, which then was really took off, and it was core to what happened in China in the 80s and 90s, letting local governments try out all sorts of different variations in how they transitioned from the straight socialist economy that wasn't working out to something that made more use of markets, but was not just sort of a straight line to a free market economy, and so. Going with that, there's been, central government policies about fiscal decentralization. How much revenue do you leave with localities versus claw back to the central government and then, possibly grant to lower levels later. So in the 80s and 90s, sort of too much money was going local. Eventually, there was a fiscal reform in the mid-90s that clawed back a lot of that and sort of rationalized the system. So that most money now went to the central government and then could be reallocated to local governments. And the situation that's left a lot of local governments in now is that they really have a tremendous pressure to generate revenue just to cover their local expenses. So there's a lot of concern that the central government is mandating various policies that sound very good, but not actually allocating money to local governments that they need to cover those expenditures. And so cities that are prospering for whatever reason, whether it's access to raw materials or from foreign trade, those places have plentiful revenues and can spend them freely on whatever they want. But the places that are struggling are having a hard time making ends meet.
Sure. So you would expect in the base case that cities with weaker fiscal bases that have to depend more on the government would be more responsive to government reforms, but that doesn't seem to be the case according to your research. So could you describe a little bit the empirical approach you took to this problem and how you tried to gauge the responsiveness levels of these different provinces?
Sure. So the main measure we use is a set of measures of environmental transparency that were put together by some people at the Natural Resources Defense Council and their Chinese partner organization called IPE, they measured for each city there were two different measures. One of them was a pollution information transparency index, which is basically how readily did this city disclose information about the pollution from specific factories. And this was they put this in place immediately after the central government implemented a set of open government information regulations, which apply not only to pollution but to a lot of areas. But pollution was the environmental ministry was the first to put out regulations on this and has been an enthusiastic proponent of it. from the start. So that's why these NGOs took the opportunity to say, well, let's rank people and let's sort of encourage the ones who do well and maybe prod the ones that aren't doing so well. So what we do is we're not interested in actually whether these transparency regulations, what their effect is. Other people have looked at that since, but our interest was in the tremendous variation in how sort of enthusiastically different cities acted to put them in place. And there was a lot of variation. A lot of it had to do with, how rich and developed cities were, their per capita income. A rich city just maybe, they already have people who say know how to build a website and, on staff, and they can just do it. But there were also, that only explained part of the variation. So we're sort of looking at, what other factors were there. And something we found that was a big deal and actually mattered almost as much as GDP per capita. I mean, it's closely related to it, but it seemed to actually matter more, was the budgetary revenue that the city had. So how not just how much money does that city make as an economy, but how much does the city government control? How much money does the city government control relative to the size of the population that they have to serve? And when they tended to have more revenues, they tended to put this in place more rapidly and more effectively. And when they had less revenues, they put it in place more slowly.
So this you describe as creating a race to the bottom as well as a race to the top dynamic. So first, maybe walk through what's happening in the more effective, larger, richer cities.
Yeah. So then the next step that we took was to look at how not just sort of I think the easy way to think of it is to look at there's the rich cities compared to the poor cities, how other things affected this choice of implementing the transparency regulations in those cities. And broadly speaking, what we found is that in the rich cities, the more polluted they were, the more transparent the more eagerly they embraced transparency. Whereas in the poor cities, the more polluted they were, the less eagerly they embraced transparency. And so, our thinking on that is, so the race to the top is the richer cities. They, in those cities, it seems like they were, viewed pollution as a problem to be solved, and were willing to, embrace this transparency, which might actually hurt some of their larger industrial firms, since they're some of the big polluters, in the spirit of sort of taking their economic development to the next level. And they could afford to do that because they had plentiful revenues. Whereas the poor cities, they, had very few sources of revenue. And as such, they were very reluctant to risk harming any of them by putting in place a policy that would force these places to some of these polluting firms to disclose exactly what they were really putting in the air and the water. So that was one result we found. The other sort of similar, relating to foreign direct investment in the cities that had bountiful revenues and sort of stable budgets. The more foreign direct investment they had, the more compliant they were with these new transparency regulations. So that suggested to us that they're sort of maybe getting the high end of foreign investment, the firms that are maybe the large multinationals that already maintain high pollution standards and are actually happy to have the whole city come on board with them to go along with standards that maybe because of their international reputation or their prominence they would have to follow anyway. And so that's sort of one end of things. But then again, at the low end, it looked more like the more FDI they had, then the less willing they were to put in place transparency. And that kind of fits with the other story, the competing story about how sort of the flows of global capital affect environmental regulation. And that competing story is that there's the story of a race to the bottom. That places with, the softest regulations will attract kind of dirty, polluting firms. Those firms will migrate to wherever they can get the easiest ride and the laxest oversight. And so it suggests that these places with limited budget revenues were, if they had any foreign direct investment, it was more likely to be of that kind that was looking for sort of a pollution haven, as opposed to the high end kind that was hoping to bring everyone else up to their level.
Sure. Could you talk a little bit about the incentives facing party members in these respective cities?
Yeah. So these are definitely decisions made by party members. So for listeners who know China, this will be familiar, but the party basically, there's not the environmental ministry is nominally separate and reports in a line all the way up to the ministry in Beijing, but in practice your local environmental protection bureau is getting funding from the local government, so that's one channel of influence the local government has over it, and then also the local party branch is going to be basically decides everyone's career path within the party and the state. And so the local party branch is going to decide who gets appointed to your office and what your next promotion is afterwards, whether you're evaluated as having done a good job. And if you've messed up their development plan, or put them in an even deeper budget hole by making life hard on some influential firms, then that's not going to be good for your career. So there's a lot of pressures they can exert on the local environmental protection bureau, and so that basically means that the local mayor and the party secretary are really the ones who will be the key decision makers. And if they favor this embracing environmental transparency, it'll happen a lot faster, and if they don't like it, it's going to happen much more slowly. And so their incentives are they themselves are hoping to get to advance within the party, and they're in sort of a cutthroat competition within this kind of meritocratic system, right? But it's a meritocracy that historically is the primary measure of merit, aside from mouthing the appropriate the latest party slogans. The main measure of merit has been to generate economic growth. And economic growth is sort of a slow-moving thing that's hard to influence, as every politician discovers to their chagrin when they get in power. But some things are easier to control, like how much revenue do you gather, and are you the one who's always begging the center for a handout, or are you the one who can cover your own costs and have some money left over to, say, build a nice show project that will impress the higher ups when they come visit you to see what you've been doing with your city. And so that's why this revenue issue becomes so central for them.
So if you were sitting on the Politburo and wanted to try to untangle this knot, what steps would you recommend that the party take here?
Well, I think that it's a challenge in the sense that every they face a challenge that a lot of corporations face of or really any large organization, right? How do you give people the right incentives? Again, so that's actually coming back to my my own background. My PhD is actually in economics from a business school, and where a lot of the people are specialized in organizational design and this mechanism design. And so I come at it from that perspective, even when I'm just looking at empirical data. And so I think what the problem they face is, some things that are easier to, if you measure certain things because they're easier to measure, then you'll tend to get more results, in the things you measure. And so they really need to find a way to, if they're serious about some of these softer things like improved environmental quality, they either need to lessen the incentives for economic growth, assuming they take that seriously, or assuming they take the environment as seriously as they now increasingly claim to. they need to also give people more of a pass on growth and also be stricter about consequences for localities that are lax on regulation or that have are poor performers in terms of environmental outcomes. So it's not really that much of it's not a magic formula, but it is something that they need to take seriously and push a little bit harder on if they believe in it. And given that a lot of the time the formal rules of what the laws say are very different from the actual practice of what people value in the party, it can take some time to change perceptions down at the lower levels, even if at the top they believe themselves to be sincere.
Well, let's wish them the best of luck. So before we get to recommendations, if you could just let everyone know where they could follow you and find more of your work.
Sure. So I am on Twitter as at Peter Lorentzen. So my last name is spelled Lorentzen. So it's just my first and last name together with no spaces or dots or anything. Peter Lorentzen. And my website is also the same, www.peterlorentzen.com. And I post all of my published research and working papers there.
Great. So, Peter, if you could recommend a book or two that you've enjoyed recently related to these topics or just on China in general, and maybe a topic that you don't think has been appropriately given a book-like treatment in English on anything related to China.
Well, so in terms of good books related to this topic, one that just came out that I'm really looking forward to sitting down to read is by Diana Fu from the University of Toronto. She has a book called Mobilizing Without the Masses, Control and Contention in China. So it's based on her field work in China, talking with particularly with labor organizers and others, trying to understand how they operate in the kind of environment that I described with this kind of controlled contentious politics. And I've seen her present pieces of the work, and so the key thing in a lot of cases is they sort of have to play a very careful game of sort of organizing without being organizers. So you can't form an independent union in China or labor rights advocacy group. So instead, they kind of just provide advice to workers that come in and suggest what they might do and kind of guide them informally without formally making them part of an organization and without putting any kind of stamp of approval or letting it be known that they are behind that. So they sort of help. As I see it, I think that they're helping these people to play the game of protest as within the rules set by the party without overstepping those bounds. But by doing so, they do at least give them more ability to make the claims against local authorities or employers that the party is willing to let them make, as long as they do it in the kind of right format. Well, the book that I want to read to plug myself a little bit, I guess, is the book that I'm hoping to finally finish writing on this topic. The title will be Controlled Burn, and it'll be talking about this dynamic with protests and also looking at a very similar dynamic that plays out in the context of media and the sort of leeway that the party gives to investigative journalists, and when it gives them more and then when it reins that back in. That's sort of been almost finished for a little bit too long, and so I'm looking forward to finishing it and getting it out there so that everyone else can read it.
Awesome, great. Well, looking forward to checking that out, Peter. Thank you so much for your time today. This was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was great talking to you.
脸皮最厚，啤酒喝不够，爱吃肉，其实喝 我也难受。饭后百步走，溜溜五道口，满大街都是野狗，没有我想要的妞，太燥了，卷一袋穿一袋呼一袋，心情不好早晚都得得癌，臭无赖，你们呀爱来不来，对不对？再者说不想买票就马路边上滋一道，左手拿着啤酒，右手摸着灯儿，眼睛都瞄着姑娘大腿根儿。这么美好的一天就这么胡逼了，今天说的话明天就变成狗屁了。我操，小混混要完也得翻篇儿，中了500万我也不混有钱人的圈儿，实在没事儿就回家玩 PS2。俄罗斯方块还是来盘实况，什么情况？1比6输了，非常失望。他妈球门那么大，就非得打那门框，真他妈丧！还是小妞身上最香，他们都爱吃我的大香肠。哦吼吼！我们做人的原则非常明确，不想当傻逼，都别跟我旁边吹牛逼。社会发展太快，只有我们知道 hip hop 的未来。所有人都得死，金属、朋克都得死，古典、流行都得死，没有任何麻了逼的原因，就好像东北人爱吹牛逼，大卫胡金涛都是你们的亲戚，麦口桥鞍山撞死雷锋成了你们的兄弟。要满天的黄土实在没法喘气，看见谁都想看见秃尾巴老李，呼了那么多的叶子还不他妈一天下雨，可这北京城都找不着一口新鲜空气，都是屁 motherfuck 一炸霹雳，人活着就得犯傻逼，要停车不给发票属于贪污行为，捅了多大篓子也没有人给你顶雷，开军车闯红灯是着急给你舅舅送信儿，警车开上便道不是为了抓贼，要